And sometimes in the research, it's called pluralistic ignorance. This idea that when you're in a meeting, everyone in the meeting knows the meeting is dysfunctional, but no one wants to speak up because no one else is speaking up. And so we know collectively the meeting is bad, and yet we don't take action. People are using the technology to offload the work they should be doing and using it as a lazy substitute for real work and smart thinking. There are two people that tend to leave a meeting more satisfied than anyone else. So one is the person who talks the most, and second is the person who organizes and leads the meeting. And so what we see for new managers and new leaders is they disproportionately schedule more meetings. And I think a lot of it is because they aren't fully sure how to lead their team. They're learning the ropes. Meetings become a familiar space to do a whole host of things that probably can be done asynchronously.
Dr. Rebecca Hinds, welcome to the Made Leader podcast. I'm so glad to have you on today.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, for the listeners, do you mind doing a brief intro, telling them about yourself?
Sure. So I've always been fascinated by how organizations work, organizational behavior. So a lot of my academic research focused in that area. My bachelor's, master's, and PhD all in organizational behavior and how do we design great organizations around technology, in particular, emergent new technology. After my academic career, I started the Work Innovation Lab at Asana, which was our, and still is, our Asana's internal think tank devoted to helping leaders navigate change related to hybrid work, remote work, AI. And then recently this summer, I joined Glean to lead our Work AI Institute, partnering with great experts to conduct research on AI and the change management, the human piece around AI that we know is so important as part of any transformation. And my new book, Your Best Meeting Ever, is out February 3rd. And that's been, an area of deep passion for me in terms of how to help organizations and leaders in particular redesign, rethink their meetings. And so I've worked with every size of organization, every industry to help them fix this pervasive problem of dysfunctional meetings.
Oh, yes. And I haven't heard many people talk about meetings and passion in the same sentence. So I'm glad, I'm glad you're passionate about it because we need some help. So, Rebecca, what is the biggest lie we tell leaders about meetings specifically?
So I think fundamentally that meetings are a necessary evil. And we often, whether we tell people explicitly or it's very much implicit in the culture, we think of meetings as something we incur as a necessary part of doing business. And we associate meetings with negativity. And there's a lot of research to show we have this negativity bias around meetings. A lot of that is rooted in reality. So many meetings are dysfunctional and bad that they have this aura of negativity. But the fact that meetings are assumed to be broken by design and something we need to do and something that has this negative connotation, I think is the biggest myth and lie.
Well, we're going to dispel some of those myths, but everyone complains about meetings. Like it is like I always wonder, like who's scheduling these meetings if everyone is complaining? Because we're still having them, right? We keep scheduling. So, what made you get deeply passionate about meetings and say, I need to write an entire book to fix meetings?
And sometimes in the research, it's called pluralistic ignorance. This idea that when you're in a meeting, everyone in the meeting knows the meeting is dysfunctional, but no one wants to speak up because no one else is speaking up. And so we know collectively the meeting is bad, and yet we don't take action. I wanted to solve this problem because, I do research on a lot of different future of work topics. I've helped organizations think through various strategies, hybrid work to now AI. And meetings are consistently the biggest challenge. They show up in every transformation. When we saw it through the pandemic with hybrid and remote work, meetings were the key activity that was continually dysfunctional, even got worse in many cases. And with AI, we're seeing the same thing. The AI problems, the shortcomings with strategies, they're showing up in meetings in a way that I am confident we can learn a lot from organizations just by looking at how they how they schedule meetings. And when we think about knowledge workers, desk workers, we know we spend 85 to 90% of our time collaborating. And most of that time, in terms of the most common form of collaboration, happens in meetings. And so when we think about improving our organizations, improving ourselves as leaders, meetings are such a ripe area for dysfunction, for improvement because of how dysfunctional they are.
Yeah. So you just said something that I want to ask about. You said AI, the shortcomings are showing up. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm curious.
Sure. So, what we're seeing in meetings, and Jen, I'm sure you've seen it as well, we're starting to attend meetings where there are multiple AI note taker bots.
Yes,
Often, there are
yes.
more bots in the room than humans. And when we think about it, the crux of the problem around meetings is the lack of intentional design. And so the premise of the book is we need to treat meetings as a product, very intentionally designed. And what we're
Hmm.
seeing with AI in so many cases, but especially in meetings, people are using the technology to offload the work they should be doing and using it as a lazy substitute for real work and smart thinking. And so when we start to see multiple AI note takers in a meeting, that's a pretty clear sign the meeting hasn't been intentionally designed, because just as we think about the attendees in a meeting, humans, we should be thinking about the role AI plays in meetings. There should be one clear purpose, one note taker bot. Not only is it less distracting for folks, but also you end up with these slightly different versions of reality in a way where no one's sure the source of truth. And so, that's a manifestation of this default reaction to using meetings to solve problems. Now we're seeing AI come into the mix in ways that are making dysfunctional meetings even worse.
So we're going to talk about what you called false prophets. I love that term in just a minute. But if you had to really succinctly say what a good meeting is, how would you describe? I know you have 7 design principles. We're going to try to touch on that. Your book was so rich in tangibles, I couldn't cover it in the interview. Of course, I need to get your book. But what does a good meeting look like?
So the each chapter of the book is anchored in a product design principle applied to meetings, because if we are going to treat meetings as a product, meetings are the most important product in our entire organizations and the least optimized. And so one of those principles is around user-centric design. Just as we design great products for the user first, we need to be designing our meetings for the user of those meetings, and that user, they're the attendees, they're not yourself as the organizer. And there's lots of research to show, and some research from my collaborator Stephen Rogelberg, that shows there are two people that tend to leave a meeting more satisfied than anyone else. So one is the person who talks the most, and second is the person who organizes and leads the meeting. And so we can't evaluate meetings based on what the organizer says or thinks, based on how effective the meeting has been or the person who talks the most. We need to be asking the attendees. And so one simple strategy I use with organizations is called ROTI, return on time investment. Just as we evaluate return on investment for products, we should be applying that same discipline to our meetings. So it's a 0 to 5 scale. As a meeting organizer, after about 10% of your meetings, you're asking attendees, was this meeting worth my time? And we talked about the negative sentiment around meetings. That skews how people evaluate meetings, in the sense of you can't just go into an organization or ask your own employees whether meetings are effective or whether they like the meetings you run, because you trigger this negativity bias. But if you anchor in time, if you're asking people, was this meeting worth your time? It starts to become more level set, in terms of everyone has an intuitive sense of whether their time is well spent, well invested. And so often that's a great gut check to determine if a meeting has been effective. Is it worth the attendee's time?
Okay, let's go down this track. Um, I love that. I just want to put a highlight on what you said is only 10% of meetings. Like, don't do it after everyone, right?
Yes, you don't want survey overload. There's all sorts of research in terms, and that's why it's one question. You can ask a second part, which is, what could I do as the organizer that would boost your rating by 1 point? So sometimes it's 2 points, sometimes it's 1 point in terms of the question, but you don't want to be overwhelming people. In most cases, it should be anonymous, so people aren't biased to answer in a certain way. And then that should be paired with other metrics you can glean through the technology using analytics that don't require the heavy lifting of the attendees.
Okay, because you just answered the question I was going to ask is what if you get like a zero or a one? Like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
counteract that? You really have to ask that follow up, right? Because otherwise, if you get like a really low score, you're like, well, what do I do with this, right?
I've run a bunch of meeting doomsdays in organizations, which are complete calendar cleanses. And so often, just having the number is a good sense of the meetings you don't want to bring back onto your calendar. But you're absolutely right. In order to design better meetings, we need some feedback. And often I find you'll see bifurcated ratings. So you'll see a group that rates the meeting a 4 or 5, and then a group that rates the meeting 0 to 1. And that's a pretty good indication that you've designed a meeting that's worthwhile for a subset of attendees, and the other subset of attendees probably doesn't need to be invited to the meeting.
Yeah, no, that's a great tool for people to use because I want to ask you a little bit about the doomsday because that's fascinating. Just everything's going. I love the examples in your book, but you talk to and go back to the false prophets term that you use, right? So they talk about, oh, and I've done this too. I have a whole meeting toolkit, right? Here's an intention, be intentional. Have a meeting agenda, duh, like common sense stuff. You talked about AI. I'll just have the AI note taker go. The cost calculators are really big. And one of my past podcast guests is like, just look around and see how much it cost, right? What do those do? Like, is that a first step? Because it feels like the first step is probably just going through these seven design principles. But what have you seen as far as success when organizations put one of these uh, profits into place?
So they don't work because they don't fix the underlying problem. And often what we see, we have a pervasive productivity theater problem in organizations across the board where we think that just checking the box, just sending the email, just turning your Slack light green, or filling your calendar is a substitute for real progress and real productivity. And we see it with agendas as well. There's no conclusive evidence to show that having an agenda improves the effectiveness of a meeting. And that is because it's not just about doing the thing, it's not just about checking the box, it's about how we design these mechanisms of collaboration and coordination. And likewise with AI, I think AI is the best example where we're seeing organizations try to check the box in a way that doesn't lead to meaningful business improvements and often overwhelms employees. And so, Meeting Doomsday, at the core of that is the recognition that sometimes we do need to start from a fresh slate. And what we find with Meeting Doomsday is when you compare it to traditional meeting audits, where the meetings are still on your calendar, you're evaluating them one by one, that keeps you in the mindset of defending the things that are already on your calendar. Whereas Meeting Doomsday allows you to start from a completely new slate. What would it look like to design the perfect meeting for my specific work and my team's specific work right now? And so we see not only do you gain a lot of time in terms of the time savings by redesigning the meetings, but we also see fundamentally people start to think about meetings much more intentionally.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. This is going off of memory from your book, but did it not happen where meeting doomsday happened in one organization, but after a year or so, they started trickling back into meetings that weren't really the best use of everyone's time?
That's right. So I first studied the Meeting Doomsday concept at Dropbox. They called it Our Meeting Get In, and there have been a bunch of iterations on the Meeting Doomsday. The Our Meeting Get In, Slack declared calendar bankruptcy, Shopify did a calendar purge, all of these examples. But what we saw at Dropbox was the meetings, the meeting debt, as I call it in the book, just as you have product debt, you have meeting debt. Legacy meetings pile up. There's a sense of guilt associated with removing meetings. And so I recommend every organization do a meeting doomsday at least once a year, if not more frequently. Now, what's distinct about the meeting doomsday as compared to our meeting get in or the calendar bankruptcy is it's intentionally designed to put the power and autonomy in the hands of employees. So often organizations will do these calendar purges, and essentially it's a bot that comes in and sweeps the calendar. It's the IT team. Meeting Doomsday is very intentionally designed in terms of giving employees the autonomy to decide which meetings to rebuild. And what that does is it triggers what's sometimes called the IKEA effect, right? We know that when employees build something themselves, they're more likely to value it, they're more likely to stick to it. And so I see meeting doomsdays have a much more enduring effect on employees in terms of them wanting to keep the calendar clean, but still it needs to be a recurring discipline that organizations commit to.
Right. And it sounds like the doomsday concept has really taken a hold in tech. And
Mhm.
I'm really hoping other sectors can just consider it. Have you seen it translate to any other industry, or have you mainly seen it in tech?
I've mainly seen it in tech, but no, I've seen it in other industries as well, and I think especially legacy industries that just recognize the need to do something different. Often they'll want to jump on the bandwagon of some of these tech companies. Academic institutions too, universities tend to be overflowing with meetings. Government organizations as well. I've seen it. I've seen it work even more effectively in those organizations when often there's no intentional reset through the year. It needs to be done at the team level at least, or the organizational level in the best cases, so that you're
Okay.
committed to it as an organization. Or else it's hard to make changes to meetings as such an interdependent form of communication and coordination. It ideally happens at the organizational level.
Yes, definitely. Some of my government clients, I can never see them doing this, but I love the concept. I would love them to think about it from a team level or even just starting with questioning. But regardless, you've got 7 principles for designing better meetings. I was wondering if you could just walk through each one of those 7, not in detail, but hey, here are the 7. And then for a new manager who is just kind of drowning in back-to-back meetings, it is just one of the realities of leadership, unfortunately, if you could guide them where you would start first.
Sure. And I want to touch on your point. Often
Yeah.
I do see this resistance to meeting doomsdays. And what I've learned through many, many years of doing this is you can't just tell people that their meetings are bad and expect action, because what you get is, why should I change? My meetings are bad, but they're not any worse than anyone else's. We've gotten this far with this inertia on our calendar. And so the more we can frame it in the business metrics that matter most to the organization. And so I've worked with a government organization where their primary goal for the year was velocity. They were moving too slow, and as an organization, they wanted to commit to moving faster. And so we were able to tie the meeting metrics to measures of velocity within the organization. And that type of association, regardless of whether it's causal, just showing the correlation between too many meetings and velocity among individual teams or initiatives tends to spark action in a way that just telling people to run the meeting doomsday doesn't do, because I've seen that resistance. Some folks will jump on board right away, but others, it's important to ground the impetus in the why and the business metrics that matter most for the organization. And if you tell a sales organization this is how bad meetings correlate to negative relationships with customers, that has a different level of impetus than bad meetings.
Yeah, solid point. I mean, always tying it to business metrics will help people go, oh, okay, I understand, right? It's not taking it personally, like, oh, your meetings suck. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
this is for the business. This is to get us to move faster. I think that's a great point.
So that, and that brings us to the first principle. So the first
Yeah.
principle is around meeting debt. This idea, just as we have product debt, we have meeting debt, legacy meetings. And so often that type of reset, calendar cleanse, meeting doomsday, there are other strategies in the book as well. But fundamentally, it's about, taking a clean slate and starting fresh in terms of what actually deserves to be a meeting on the calendar. So the first principle, meeting debt. The second principle is around metrics, which we spoke briefly about. Measuring our meetings, making sure we're measuring the right things, and that ROTI, return on time investment, is one strategy to do that. The third principle is around becoming a meeting minimalist. So just as great products are minimalistic, the same should be true with our meetings. Less clutter, less noise. And I like to think about this in terms of four dimensions of the meeting. So the length, the frequency, the cadence, the attendees, and the agenda items. And within the book, there are specific strategies across each dimension in terms of how do you minimalize meetings, shorter meetings, fewer attendees, fewer agenda items, and a less frequent cadence. Fourth is around systems thinking. So just as great products aren't designed in isolation, Apple's the classic example where, our iPhone speaks to our Mac, speaks to our AirPods. Same with meetings. Meetings are part of a bigger communication system. And often I find at the root of meeting problems is a broken communication system. And so having that clarity in terms of what are the communication tools we're going to use as an organization, what is the purpose of Slack versus email versus a meeting, is essential for employees to have clarity and avoid defaulting to meetings to solve all the problems and all the communication challenges. Five is around user-centric design, which we also spoke about. So designing the meeting for the
Mhm.
attendee, treating your attendees' time as more valuable than your own, and injecting delight into meetings too. Meetings should have some element of delight, which is a combination of surprise and joy, to make them memorable, make them human. That's why they are meetings. And that's an important part of user-centric design. Six is around rhythm. And this is something that we don't often think about. When are we scheduling meetings, and how do we use meetings alongside the rhythms of our organization? So thinking about how do you time meetings according to the fiscal calendar so they're advancing your business objectives? How do you time them according to the specific life of your project? We know, for example, that one of the most important points in a project is the midpoint. Exactly halfway through from the starting point to the deadline, there's this weird psychological power that happens where people get a burst of energy and realize that, oh shoot, we've used up half the time. Now we need to do something different. And so scheduling a meeting exactly at the midpoint is one strategy to take advantage of that energy. And there are three key points that we need to think about in terms of the project. And then at the day-to-day level, also thinking about rhythm, building in pauses through the day, no meeting days. I unpack a lot of the research and evidence on the value of no meeting days. And then the seventh principle, the final principle, is around technology. So just as we iterate and innovate our products with technology, we should be doing the same thing with meetings. So that relates to PowerPoint. It also relates to artificial intelligence and bringing AI into our meetings in a way that's intentional and the role is defined.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, there's nothing I love more than a no meeting day. And it is one of those things that even in working for myself, I can fall victim into, oh, they want to meet then. And it is really hard for me to guard my calendar. But God, it's like a dream when I wake up and I was like, I have nothing on
Well,
my
yeah,
calendar.
exactly. And what we see from a research perspective is it's sometimes called the contracting time effect, where as soon as a meeting is on our calendar, even if it's 4 hours away, we start this mental countdown and we're fixated on the idea that a meeting is upcoming. And so we naturally default to avoiding deep thinking, deep work in a way that even if we have the time, we can't devote the mental resources. And so the research on no meeting days is fascinating. Not only does it save time, boost productivity on average, it also, when we talk about managers, there's evidence to show it reduces micromanagement as well, because you're not using meetings as a surveillance tool to get updates from your team and issue requests. And cooperation improves as well, because you need to find better, more strategic ways to communicate asynchronously and start to use meetings very intentionally. So the impact goes beyond just the productivity and focus gains as well.
God, you're so right about that. Yesterday I had morning free, but afternoon appointments, all afternoon. I was like just thinking about it. It's like, what time is that again? What time is that? Like I'm preparing myself. And I did do deep work, but it was still in the back of my head,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't have as much time as I think. So yes, that is real. So out of the seven principles, where would you suggest, and I know it's all relative, right? But where would you suggest new leaders start?
Mm-hmm. So the book is written in a way that the chapters can be read out of order. I put them in a particular sequence based on what I've seen in most organizations, and most organizations are suffering from so much meeting debt, where cleansing your calendar, doing that meeting doomsday, is often the first most effective step. But it also depends on you as a manager, your strengths as a leader, what you do well. Some leaders are great at designing user centric meetings, but aren't sure how to use technology to improve the meetings, for example. They're very face to face meeting culture. So it depends on your strengths and weaknesses as an individual, as well as the level of psychological safety within the workplace, because we know that a meeting doomsday does require a certain level of psychological
Yep.
safety.
Yes, absolutely. And I think even just starting with the meeting debt, like taking a look, because you're in a new position, what already exists? What are you tempted to create, right? So are you
Mm-hmm.
even creating that meeting debt?
Yeah.
Yes, they can definitely look through all the steps and find something to
Mm-hmm.
start
And then
with.
the second principle around
Yeah.
minimalism too is a good, if you're not ready for full doomsday, then think about those four dimensions of meeting minimalism. And in particular, what we see for new managers and new leaders is they disproportionately schedule more meetings. And I think a lot of it is because
Mhm.
they aren't fully sure how to lead their team. They're learning the ropes. Meetings become a familiar space to do a whole host of things that probably can be done asynchronously. So when we think about the cadence dimension around how many meetings you're scheduling, how often you're scheduling meetings, even the length, as a new manager, I think those are ways to, in a pretty safe way and space, start to tweak these different dimensions and figure out, okay, maybe I don't need that hour meeting with my team. Maybe I need a 40-minute meeting every other week.
Yeah, so you may have answered this a little bit because the things that I've seen new leaders do, you just said they have a lot of meetings, but they make a lot of things status updates,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which it sounds like you can do asynchronously, like it doesn't need to be, but I'd love to hear more tips. Or they take all of this ownership over the team meeting to where there's
Mm-hmm.
no user input. It is really, they don't do it out of it's all about me. They do it about I'm the leader, it's my job,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
How do they overcome those hangups?
So there are lots of strategies. It's important to be clear on what is the purpose of a meeting. And so in your best meeting ever, I outline what I call the 4D CEO test, which is essentially a two-part test to determine whether a meeting needs to exist on the calendar. The first part of the test is the 4D test. So a meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, discuss, debate, or develop either yourself as a leader or the team. Status updates, they don't pass that test. Broadcast briefings for the boss don't pass that test. Even when we think about something like brainstorming, it often doesn't pass that test. And I think just the first part of the test, as a knee jerk reaction, am I deciding, discussing, debating, or developing myself or the team in this meeting? If not, it doesn't deserve to be a meeting. And even if it passes that first test, there's then the CEO test, which is essentially The content should be complex. C, there should be enough ambiguity, unknown unknowns that it requires the back and forth conversation, or it's much more efficient to do so. So often, status updates, little complexity, you're reporting on something that's already happened. And so that often doesn't pass the second test either. Emotionally intense is the E. So a meeting should only exist if there's some form of emotional intensity. You're needing to manage emotions, read emotions, you're delivering harsh feedback, difficult conversations. And then O, from Amazon, is it a one-way door decision? Meaning, once you walk through, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to revert course and go back the other way. In that case, the cost of misalignment is too high not to get in a 15-minute meeting. So pass the 40 test, and then it should pass either the C, E, or O test as well.
Okay, so let me go back to something you said. Is brainstorming does not fall into the 4D category. So what do you do with brainstorming?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a lot of research, overwhelming research to show we brainstorm better individually than collectively, which is contrary to how we're conditioned to believe. We picture brainstorming, we picture the sticky notes, the ideas flying around on the whiteboard, but it's much more effective to brainstorm individually. You avoid that group think, especially if there's a powerful person or leader in the room. You're not biased in a certain way. Brainstorm individually. And then when it comes time to discuss the ideas, debate them, build on one another, that's when you're in the 4D territory, and it deserves to be a live meeting. But the independent brainstorming should be happening asynchronously outside the meeting in almost every case.
Okay, so confessions of a leader. Back in the day, I used to torture my team with brainstorming sessions because I love to ideate, right? Like, this is fun to me. That's where I live. They finally told me that's enough, Jen. Like, stop, because this
Well,
is not working. What are we doing with this?
I used to do the same, and it's conditioned. We think that as a leader, bringing everyone together, harnessing that energy, and absolutely, there's a component of that, but it should happen after you've given space to asynchronously brainstorm.
Yes, and the ironic part is that, like, I am an introspective thinker. Like, I need that
Mm.
time. So I don't know what I was expecting of my team, but yes, it happens. So I was fascinated by some of the stats in your book that you said that managers, so when you compare them to frontline employees and senior leaders, the middle has the most time in meetings spent at almost 6 hours, and that has actually increased after COVID. So I think there is this piece, especially for new leaders, that they don't feel comfortable pushing back on anyone really, because they're like, oh, yes, I need to go, right? But peers, even their employees who are putting updates or meetings on their calendar. So, what do you suggest that they say in a way that's not going to kind of, get them on the naughty list, if you will?
Hmm. And that time is unproductive meetings. So it's not just meetings, it's the time we spend in unproductive meetings that is astonishing when we think about, the better part of a day spent in these dysfunctional sort of time sucks really. And so this is something again that depends so heavily on the psychological safety of the individual and the team environment. Often I'll work with leaders where there isn't that psychological safety to say, this is a bad meeting, let's fix it. And so I recommend, and this work comes from Amy Edmondson in many ways, who coined the term psychological safety, framing your suggestion as curiosity is a way to disarm sort of the hesitation, sometimes the threat, if we're talking about a difference in hierarchy. So, not saying, this meeting isn't effective, but saying, hey, I've noticed that 20 minutes of this 30-minute meeting is spent on status updates and we rarely have time for real discussion. What if we did this? That tends to disarm the threat because you're coming from a place of curiosity and understanding rather than making an assertion. Data and analytics is a good way to do this as well. The more you can frame your criticism of the meeting or the opportunity in objective data helps a lot. And then increasingly, I'm seeing and working with organizations to think about how do we use AI and technology to remove some of that burden on the manager to push back, or the individual contributor to push back on bad meetings. So I've worked with organizations that have a automatic setup in the calendaring system where if the meeting doesn't have an agenda, it's automatically deleted 24 hours before the meeting. If only 5 of the 10 attendees have accepted, it's deleted. And so you can start to think about what are those specific nudges. I've also seen, you're about to schedule your 10th recurring meeting of the week or the quarter. Think about that more closely. And I talk about the different types of nudges, speed bumps, full on barriers that you can administer as leaders and individual contributors. But the more we can also use technology to take some of the onus off of ourselves as humans with a lot of emotions and emotional baggage at play, I think that's a very healthy practice.
Yes, I would love that prompt, that speed bump of just saying, "Hey, there's no agenda. Boop, it's going to be canceled."
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Please, if you're listening, do that. The one thing you said something about 5 out of 10 people. One of the things that you put in your book is that no more than 7 to 8 people in a meeting. Is
Mm-hmm.
that the right, like the max number?
In almost all cases, there shouldn't be very many meetings on your calendar that are more than 8 people, because what we see is that's sort of the magic number where social loafing really starts to kick in. We don't feel accountable for the outcome of the meeting. And multitasking also rises, especially in virtual settings, which, it's very easy to invite 10, 20 people to the meeting. Multitasking starts to rise very quickly when we have more people in the room because there's that lack of accountability.
Gotcha. I found that interesting. Because yes, I've even noticed in trainings, right? When there's a smaller group, you kind of have to be engaged, right? It's very
Mm-hmm.
obvious, but if
Yeah.
there's a big training, anyone can check out. So I
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to call that out in case anyone is about to schedule a really large meeting, just
And
in case.
it's such a great point. And often we think, it's a detriment to the individual who's not contributing. And that's true. They're wasting time that they could be better spending outside and on deep work. But it's also a distraction to the people in the room. We start to get frustrated when we don't see people contributing. We start to wonder why they're in the room. And it's also, a negative impact on the other attendees in the room who are contributing and who are invested in the conversation and outcomes.
Yes, yeah, people notice for sure.
Mhm.
So, Rebecca, if you were having coffee with an early leader tomorrow, what would you suggest they start doing and stop doing?
A lot of the recommendations in the book relate to documenting and being intentional about how we're designing meetings. And something as simple, I think the first step is, as a manager, give your employees clarity in terms of that communication stack that you're using as a team. Ideally, this should be done at the organizational level, but often it's not. Employees want that clarity in terms of, when is a meeting justified? Use that 4D CEO rule. When do I use Slack? When do I use email? And that clarity is often the first step to better meetings.
All right. Anything they should stop doing?
Stop using meetings as the default reaction. I talk in the book about, meetings have an enormously important purpose in our organizations, but they should be used as the last resort, not the knee-jerk reaction. And I think having that mental model of, am I using this meeting as a last resort? Can I communicate asynchronously? Can I accomplish what I want to accomplish in the meeting in other forms? Is a useful gut check to avoid stop using the meeting just as a solution to every problem or every whiff of uncertainty.
Yeah, I like what you said, last resort, right? You can have a meeting, but what are the other options before you just slap some time on the
Exactly.
calendar? Great advice. Rebecca, where can people find out more about you and connect?
Sure. So my book is on Amazon as well as your favorite bookstore, Your Best Meeting Ever. My website's rebeccahinds.com, and I'm on LinkedIn and would love to connect and hopefully hear more about your best meeting ever.
Yes, I will link all of that up in the show notes. But before we close out, is there anything you want to leave the listeners with? Anything I didn't ask you, or you just want to leave behind?
The intentionality around meetings is something that I deeply believe in and am passionate about. And there are lots of parts of the book where, they require more detailed, rigorous analytics to implement, but a lot of the content is quite simple in terms of the implementation and quite actionable to do tomorrow. And so I think, taking, especially in the beginning of the year, it's the best time to reset your calendar, rethink about what deserves to be a meeting, and take these small steps to start to improve our cultures around meetings.
Great advice. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for your time and thank you for writing a wonderful book that organizations need.
Thanks so much, Jen. This has been fun.